Welcome to the Air Medical Today podcast. My name is Edward Marasco, and I am your host for episode 42 on February 17th, 2022. This podcast is part of the Marasco Podcast Network, a podcast that inform by focusing on both the news and the people behind the news. With each episode of Air Medical Today, we explore a specific area of the air medical industry and community through the use of interviews. You can find Air Medical Today on the web at airmedtoday.com and on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Instagram, and YouTube. The audio podcast is indexed on iTunes and the video version is on YouTube. For additional information about the guests on the podcast, I also provide background data on the Air Medical Today website. If you would like to become a sponsor and/or leave feedback, please write to webmaster@airmedtoday.com or call 612-367-6052. Today, I am interviewing Mr. Edward Marasco, the Vice President of Business Development for QuickMed Claims, and we will be discussing balanced billing and the No Surprises Act that went into effect on January 1st, 2022. Before we get to the interview, I want to go over some feedback from previous episodes and provide some general updates. Remember that Air Medical Today is also a video podcast. As always, you can listen to the podcast and now watch it on Air Medical Today YouTube channel. With the video podcast, you can sometimes see pictures that are referenced during the podcast. The link to the channel is on the Air Medical Today website. I apologize again for not being able to post to Pinterest, as Air Medical Today does have many followers there. As I mentioned in previous podcasts, their application programming interface, or API, limit is for only 3 posts a day. And as followers know, there are many more posts than that each day. Also, on the Air Medical Today Instagram site, you can see all the posts with the URL to the news site, but the links are not clickable. This is just how Instagram works, unfortunately. If you have not listened to past podcasts, please take the time to do so. There's a wealth of information from some of the key leaders in air medical and EMS transport. Please tune into this informative and timeless podcast. I would also like to thank the followers of Air Medical Today on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Instagram, and YouTube. To date, Air Medical Today has 30,634 likes or followers, and it keeps growing. Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Edward Marasco to the podcast today. I have known Ed for many years, from when we worked together through the Association of Air Medical Services and the Medical Transport Leadership Institute. Ed is currently the Vice President of Business Development for QuickMed Claims, which provides revenue cycle management and consulting services for medical transport organizations nationwide. Previously, he was Regional Vice President of Hospital-Based Services for Air Methods Corporation after the acquisition of CJ Systems. At CJ, Ed served as the Vice President for Air Medical Services. He served 13 years at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in various administrative positions, and Ed also served as Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Emergency Resource Management, a subsidiary of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and as a board member of the STAT Medevac program. He received his BS degree in secondary education from the University of Pittsburgh and an MPM degree from the H.J. Heinz School of Public Policy and Management at Carnegie Mellon University. In addition, Ed was certified as an emergency medical technician, paramedic in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He has more than 15 years of pre-hospital clinical experience and more than 35 years of healthcare management experience. Ed has been actively involved with various industry professional organizations for more than 35 years. He served as a member of the Association of Aeromedical Services Fixed Wing Committee and the Finance and Reimbursement Committee. Ed also served on the board of AIMS as the chairman of the Finance and Reimbursement Committee and for more than 4 years. He represented the Association of Aeromedical Services in the negotiated rulemaking process to establish the new ambulance reimbursement fee schedule for the Medicare program. Ed also serves on the boards of several healthcare organizations, including his present role as the chairman of the board at Jefferson Hospital, a subsidiary of the Allegheny Health Network. He also serves on the West Penn Allegheny Health System, the Medevac Foundation International, and the Jefferson Regional Foundation. He is one of the founding members for the Cures for Kids Foundation and also an adjunct instructor of rehabilitation science and technology in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to the Air Medical Today podcast, Ed. It's really great to have you here. I know you're really busy with work, so thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, Edward, it's always great to be with you. I'm going to enjoy spending some time. We don't get to catch up nearly enough, so
I know it. Time just goes by, and we've known each other quite a long time too. So
yeah, we don't want to give that away. They'll know our age.
That's right. Yeah, I just celebrated a big birthday last Saturday. So, like I always do on these, I learned so much too, is that I'd like to tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and, what your background is, and not just that, they've only known you in one job or two. So let's talk a little bit about your personal life. You're originally from near Pittsburgh, McKeesport, Pennsylvania. What were your early years like?
Oh gosh, it was much like you, it was a steel town, right? In those days, everybody worked in the steel mill. You graduated from high school, and that's what you did. And I was one of the few in my family circle. I came from two really big families, so I had tons of cousins that I was raised with, and it's kind of funny. Everybody went to work in the mill, and I didn't. I went off to the University of Pittsburgh. Was actually interesting. I was headed to law school, so I decided to do secondary education undergrad. And that never happened. I fell in love with EMS, but it was great growing up there. It was a nice blue collar town, lots of family around.
Yeah. I was real surprised because that's one thing I did not know about you, is that you actually were accepted at a couple of law schools, and that you didn't do that. And when I look back at the things that I've known you about, I could see kind of that legal mind that you have. So why was it just your love of EMS that got you away from going to law school?
It really was. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, my father, until he passed away, my kids would love that. They would say, "Hey, Pap, didn't Dad get accepted to law school?" And he would say, "Oh, yeah, letters written from congressmen and all that stuff. Had a job in Las Vegas." My uncle, was a practicing attorney, went to Las Vegas in 1960 with my aunt. And so, I had an offer to join the firm, the family firm. My cousin actually worked in the family firm until his folks passed away. Yeah, so my dad, he used to always grouse around about that. You didn't go, you never went.
Were you expected to come back and be an attorney for the firm?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That was it.
Yeah.
That was the deal.
Yeah, so
set up for life.
So your degree, though, was in secondary education. What was the reason for that?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. As you're looking, a lot of young people are looking at different degrees now, and it's so hard. When you're young, you're trying to make a decision. But I wanted to have a fallback in case I didn't get in. So pre-law was one of those things that buttonholed you as, you had to get accepted or not. And I thought, well, if I did education, I could find a job. There were lots of teaching jobs in those days, and so I would not be stuck. And of course, that was, my dad was one of those guys. You got to have a plan. You got to have a plan B. So yeah, it was mostly a plan B. I love to teach. I love it today. I still enjoy it a great deal. So it actually worked out really well for me.
Yeah, I think I did know that about you. And of course, we work together. We'll talk about MTLI, but you're an excellent teacher too. So you've used those skills. So You talked a little bit that you went into healthcare. So how did you then go into healthcare? What was the impetus? I mean, was it, I think you worked as an EMT. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, it was kind of funny. As a young guy, I was on a school trip actually, and encountered, unfortunately, a boy drowned in a hotel swimming pool.
Oh,
And I was there and with another colleague, and we started CPR. We had taken a CPR class at school in those days, and actually he went on to become an emergency physician, as it stands. But I sort of got involved, and then like most people of that era, you're watching TV, the show Emergency was on, and I
right.
sort of got enamored with it. And then in high school, I was looking for a summer job and got a job as a lifeguard. And here you went for CPR training to get recertified at the local rescue squad. And as it turns out, they were running an advanced first aid class. So they said, "Hey, you guys aren't going to probably do much CPR up there at the pool, but you're probably going to have people with cuts and bruises, and maybe someone might fall and need splinted. So you should think about this class." So a couple of the lifeguards, we took it, and actually all of us, all the folks who took advantage of it, spent a stint in EMS. And so when we got out of the class at the end of the summer, they said, "Here's an application. You can join the rescue squad." And I did, and that was it. Kind of fell in love and did it there. It was a smaller community where I did it. So the call volume, I think it was, it might have been 350 calls a year. So barely, not even one a day.
Mm-hmm.
But McKeesport had a busier system. It was several thousand calls a year, a lot more variety. And so I ended up over there for a while and got more experience, and then found a job where I could actually get paid for it for a little while. There was a woman who used to come to the pool with her kids every day. And when you're running with the rescue squad, as you probably know, in those days where volunteerism was kind of waning, the daylight shifts were tough to staff. So there was a couple of us that had done what I did, went to the first aid class and joined the rescue squad. So we would take the ambulance up to the pool during the day. And if a call came in, we would leave, one or two of us would leave and would go respond to the call to cover the day shift. And so she saw the ambulance out there and she said, "Are you guys EMTs?" I said, "Yeah." She said, she was the business manager for a private ambulance service, and they were looking to hire people. And so they did. As it turned out, the reason they were hiring was because they had gotten a contract with the Center for Emergency Medicine in Western Pennsylvania to do all the interfacility non-emergency transports for the health system.
Oh.
And there was this magical new thing happening. They were starting a helicopter program called Stat Medevac, and they needed the ambulance service to not only provide transport from an off-site landing zone. It was actually on top of the hill on the University of Pittsburgh campus. It was called the OC lot. I think OC stood for Old Cemetery, if I'm not mistaken.
Uh-huh.
But bringing the patients down to Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh and Presbyterian University Hospital, as well as Montefiore Hospital. And they needed dispatchers. So we provided dispatching. We did those, transported the flight crews down. And so when Stat Medevac started on February 1st of 1984, I was driving the crews down, and I worked Sunday nights in the comm center, dispatching from P to 7 in the morning. We had one helicopter in those days. It was an interesting thing. I fell in love with everything about it.
So you were actually dispatching for Stat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And don't tell anybody this, top secret, but every third week I was going out on a 24-hour shift on Monday morning. So Joyce would come, and my wife Joyce was a medic, and she would come with a blanket and a book to read, and I would take a nap for a couple hours, and she could listen to the radios. And if we got a call, she would wake me up, and I'd get up and dispatch the call. And
well, I promise not to tell anybody about that.
that we would not be CAMES accredited in those days.
So were you dispatching for the ambulance service too, or was that was separate?
Yeah, that was separate. No, we handled just the helicopter work.
Got you. Yeah. Wow. So that's got you into sort of your first dip into all this. Mm-hmm. But then I know from reading your resume and stuff, you moved over to the Center for Emergency Medicine at University of Pittsburgh. Tell us about that and why you made that change.
It was a fantastic stroke of luck for me, and most of my career and my life in general has been about good fortune. I'm very, very blessed in that regard. But Dr. Ron Stewart had been recruited to Pitt in 1978 to start an emergency medicine training program, and he had this vision for a critical care transport program. And if anybody who knows Dr. Stewart, he was one of those guys that worked 23 hours a day. And so the dispatch center for Stat Medevac was in the offices of the Center for Emergency Medicine.
Oh,
And he worked in the comm center. Dr. Stewart would wander through at 10 o'clock at night on Sunday, and he would be working at the old IBM display writer. That was the word processing system at the time.
yeah.
Writing research grants and those sorts of things. And we got to know each other, and they had a position open. It was the Office of Life Support Programs. And it was doing all the ACLS, ATLS, the trauma training. He had a vision also back in those days. Mickey Eisenberg was out in Seattle with Seattle Fire, and they had a huge program to do general public CPR to reduce the impact of witness cardiac arrest. And so we did a big public training program in Pittsburgh in concert with the hospitals. So it was a great opportunity, and it was, from an educational standpoint, I learned so much. So Dr. Stewart sort of cornered me one day and said, "Hey, we have this opening. You might be interested in this." And it was an amazing experience to be able to go through that with him. And Dr. Paul Paris, I mean, there's so many people who came out of the program who are leaders around the country in emergency medicine. It's great.
That sounds wonderful. My only question is, did he have to wake you up on Sunday night at 10 o'clock?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you another funny story. So I'm interviewing for the job, and they were running a research study, and they were giving patients sublingual nitro tablets. And I can't remember the genesis of the study, but Rich Kaplan, who's now an emergency physician, was the director of research. And so I'm laying on a couch. They got all the medics around the area to volunteer to be a part of the study. So I'm laying on the couch. They're giving me sublingual nitros every 10 minutes, I think. I had a whopping headache, as you might imagine. You know how that works. And Paul Paris is interviewing me for the job at the Office of Life Support Programs. He's asking me interview questions. So yeah, those were the days. Sure.
Well, it's a great opportunity. But then you actually stayed at UPMC for 13 years or so? What other positions did you have?
I did. In those days, in '85, the state of Pennsylvania had just formed an independent sort of third-party agency called the Pennsylvania Trauma Systems Foundation, and they were doing accreditation. And so Presbyterian University Hospital, which was the primary teaching hospital of the University of Pittsburgh, there was a fellow there by the name of Andy Peitzman, was starting up the trauma program. And again, tremendous stroke of luck. They were looking for someone to be the administrator. They had a nurse coordinator, and of course, Dr. Peitzman was the medical director. And working with the folks at the Center for Emergency Medicine, I got exposed to him and his team. And so they recruited me to come over there. And again, another blessing. I mean, I learned a ton. So I went over in '85. We went through the accreditation process, which was a learning experience in and of itself. I had never done that before professionally. And, I was in my early 20s and, went over there to manage the trauma program. And one of the issues was, in those days, the reputation of the university was not great. You had residents in the emergency department. They weren't necessarily great to the medics. And so at that point in time, Presby's Trauma Center was the third busiest in the city, not in the state, but in the city. There were two other bigger trauma centers because we had really done a lousy job of, making the medics feel welcome. So they would just not come. They would go to other two of the other trauma centers over us. So part of it was public relations, trying to mend the fences with the EMS folks. And from there, I had great mentors in leadership. I got a chance to do many other things. I managed the trauma center for a while. Eventually, I had responsibility for all the emergency and trauma services. We had 3 different emergency departments on that campus. We merged them into one. I eventually inherited the same-day surgery program, same deal. We had 3 different same-day surgery units. We merged them up. I had the GI lab. I had home care, knew nothing about home care, in those days. So I had to learn the home care trades. I had the digestive disorders center, physical therapy, occupational therapy. And
Wow.
I asked my boss one day, I said, I'm the emergency medicine guy. I don't know. She said, that's how you're going to grow. You're going to learn more. And she was joking about it. But in reality, it caused me to learn quite a bit about healthcare and how to manage lots of people. I mean, several hundred people on the staff and in my group. And then eventually we formed an emergency physician practice. The academic emergency physicians did not necessarily want to work 40 clinical hours a week. They were teaching and doing research.
Right.
But in those days, hospital affiliations were just starting. This was in the mid 90s. And every hospital you went and talked to and said, hey, we'd love to have a relationship with you, as the university. What can we do for you? Almost everybody said, well, we can't staff our emergency department. We can't get board certified emergency physicians. And of course, the leadership of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center said, no problem, we can help you with that. But there was really no mechanism to do that. So we started a separate emergency physician practice where we hired emergency physicians who did want to work primarily clinically. And it was called Emergency Resource Management. Founded it and was the first chief operating officer there. And eventually, it's still alive today. I think it staffs 15 or 20 emergency departments. They do urgent care centers now and everything, but that was in the mid 90s. And
yeah, that's early on. You were sort of followed emergency medicine through really the growth beginnings and growth stages of that too. So, and there was a residency program there then.
Yes,
right.
There was.
Yeah.
Still today. Gosh, I think in those days it might have been, I think it was 18 residents. I think it was 6 per year. I think now it might be 30 or 40 in the program.
Was the residency program going before you came over, or were you part of starting that?
No, it started in 1981. Actually. Wow. So the center was formed in 78. The residency was in 81. Stat started in 84. And oddly enough, the emergency medicine did not get full department status within the University of Pittsburgh until actually much later than that. The residency started when there weren't yet emergency medicine attendings in the ED. The residents actually worked with the internists, and there were surgery attendings there as well.
Yeah, that's very typical. Having been on the ground helping start the residency program at Duke, I went through the same type of thing, and then getting board certified physicians, big deal. So, you, I know you currently served on some boards, hospital boards. Tell us about that and how that came about.
Yeah, I do. Our home in West Mifflin, which is, we picked a spot halfway between where I grew up and where my wife grew up when we got married. And so there was a hospital there, Jefferson Regional Medical Center, a couple of miles from my house. And that's where I got the lion's share of my medical control. I started out at McKeesport Hospital as a medic, getting control from there, but eventually worked in the West Mifflin area. And so I had medical control from the hospital. And so I've been around it for a long time while I was working at UPMC. And eventually a colleague invited me to join the board there. And so I did. It was actually in 2002. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years. And so I did that at Jefferson for a few years and served on some committees, and eventually became the vice chairman and became the chairman. And I am today. I'm just about finishing up my term there. And during about 5 or 6 years ago, there was some consolidation going on in the Western Pennsylvania healthcare marketplace. And Highmark, which is the local Blue Cross affiliate, was trying to create a provider network. And so they bought Jefferson Hospital. It was the first acquisition to form what's now called the Allegheny Health Network. And so, we sold the hospital. We got money that we put into a community foundation. So I'm on the foundation board, which has, been a fantastic experience working with local social service agencies and providing health and wellness support.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It's amazing how much, we've been able to accomplish as a group with the cash that we got. And then, so Highmark bought several other hospitals, including those hospitals that formed the West Penn Allegheny Health System. So Allegheny General Hospital, West Penn Hospital, Forbes Regional. And during that time when those acquisitions were going, they were trying to create some cross-fertilization in boards. So I ended up on the West Penn Allegheny Board of Directors as well. so that when we have lots of common, each of the hospital boards has people from the other parts of the system, as well as from Highmark itself. So it's been interesting to be a part of an integrated delivery and financing system. Has been an interesting endeavor for sure.
Because was Allegheny's a competitor with UMPC, right? So you were doing both? You were on
Yeah, actually, I had, by the time I started on the Allegheny Health Network side, I was gone from UPMC. During those days, that's when I left and I went to CJ Systems. So
okay.
yeah, so I was, but it's interesting because I did grow up on both sides, and it's amazing the number of leaders. John Paul, who was the chief operating officer at UPMC for many years, left there, and he came back and actually was the president of Allegheny Health Network during the early part of the formation of the network. So, and there's tons of people, tons of senior executives and vice president level folks who worked on both sides. Of course, a ton of frontline people too, medical staff, nurses. My wife was 34 years at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. She went back, got her nurse practitioner license, and she took a job at Allegheny Health Network actually after that, working for one of the primary care practices. So, and again, ton of people on both sides. Pittsburgh, it's a small town. So.
Well, that's great experience too. That's helpful. I didn't realize that's how Allegheny started. So that's very interesting. So let's get into the air medical side then. So you had some early start with Stat Medevac. How did you get more involved with them?
Yeah, another interesting turn of fate. So here I am, I'm on the Stat Medevac board of directors, and we had done in '86, we did some expansion. We added a second helicopter, and in those days, remote basing wasn't as common as it is today.
Right.
And so we had added a helicopter east of Pittsburgh, Westmoreland County. It was kind of a joint venture with the local ambulance service and one of the hospitals out there. And I'm at a local trade show, a Pennsylvania trade show, one day, and this fella from Allegheny General Hospital from the Lifelike program, which was the precursor. I mean, Lifelike started in 1978, been around for a long time before Stat joined. This guy corners me and he's reading me the riot act about this remote basing thing we're doing, and we don't know what we're doing, and we're going to be unsafe and all these things.
Yeah.
And so I didn't, I sort of was trying to be polite and trying to avoid a conflict. So I had never met the guy, I'd heard his name. And about 6 months later, my boss walked in and said, my office and said, we're reorganizing. We got a new guy who's coming over from Allegheny General Hospital. His name is Ford Keyes, and he's going to be your boss. I just remember going home and saying to my wife, I got to find another job. I'm never going to get this is not going to work out. And of course, Ford, his mom, Joan, who's spoken, she's spoken at the AMTC and was a psychiatric nurse, tremendous speaker. She headed up nursing at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic, which was on the UPMC side. And so they needed somebody, and Ford's name came up, and he got recruited to come over. So when Ford came on board, he said, look, we got to get you involved in the professional association. He had been president of the National Flight Nurses Association, which is a precursor to ASNA. And so he said, we got to get you involved. So he took me to the Air Medical Transport Conference, and I ended up on the fixed wing committee because we had a fixed wing aircraft at Stat Medevac. We had several actually in those days. And and Rod Crane, who
yes,
I'm in the industry for a long time. Rod was the chairman of the fixed wing committee in those days. He was running Lifelink 3.
Yes.
They're in Minneapolis. And so I served on the fixed wing committee for a while. And then Ford got elected as the president of Ames. And so he asked me to take over and chair the finance and reimbursement committee while he was there as the president of Ames. So I got exposed to that. And I don't know if you remember this, back in those days, we had a giant safety congress. Ames had sponsored a giant safety congress because of all the issues with safety in the industry.
Mid 80s were a tough time.
Yeah, exactly. And so after the dust settled a little bit after the safety congress, the Ames board got this idea to have an air medical reimbursement congress because we clearly had some lack of knowledge. We needed to educate ourselves and our membership about the nuances associated with reimbursement. And so as the chairman of the Finance and Reimbursement Committee, I actually set up the Congress. We held it here in Pittsburgh, actually. And so that was a tremendous opportunity and experience. And then, stayed on for a while and did that and continued to work. So we're friends today, Ford and Barb Kais and their daughters. I've known them for a long time. And
he went to Florida, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He went to St. Joseph's Health System in Florida for a while, and they lived through a bunch of mergers and consolidation and system development down there. And so one of those, again, those strokes of luck. I thought for sure I was going to be looking for a job,
I think that's when I was first getting involved with things, from Fairfax Hospital and going to Ames. And I remember Ford being the president and got to know him. And then I remember he left and went to Florida. So, you served on that board, but then was it Corporate Jets that had the contract, the AR operator contract?
Yes, yeah. CJ Systems as it eventually became. And the interesting thing about that was when they were trying to start Stat Medevac in 1984, the only relationship on the aviation side, the only knowledge anybody at Presbyterian University Hospital had was they had this relationship because of the organ procurement program. Tom Starzl had arrived at the University of Pittsburgh. He was, prolific transplant surgeon, liver transplants, multivisceral transplants, and the local organ procurement outfit grew by leaps and bounds. And in those days, it was kind of more of a national list. So they were bringing organs from all over the country. We had the sickest of the sick when it came to transplant patients. This is, in the 80s. And so anyway, CJ had been providing fixed wing support for the local transplant organization. So when they were looking for the helicopter, they called their friends at the aviation company. And in those days, CJ didn't have a single helicopter. It was all charter and doing, organ procurement work, which is much like charter in many respects. I mean, most of the teams don't like the stretcher in the aircraft. They want it set up so they can, be comfortable after operating all night. So, CJ went out and bought a BO-105 helicopter and brought in some people, including Larry Pietropalo, who had been selling helicopters actually for Eurocopter, which is now Airbus, as you know, and recruited Larry to come in and run the helicopter operation for CJ. So they got in with both feet in 1984. And in the late 90s, the industry was changing quite a bit. The operators were getting pressured around the finances. Most hospital-based programs realized they were not breaking even, and they didn't want to subsidize anymore as the financial pressures came in healthcare. Interesting how those things cycle back, as here we are again today talking about, reductions in reimbursement and challenges economically. And so they, some of the operators had started to do what people now call community-based operations, where they would, if the hospital couldn't afford to be in the business anymore, but they had assets, there were helicopters that were getting turned back into these operators. And so a number of those leaders, one of which was Russ Spray at Rocky Mountain Helicopters, those folks decided to do community-based operations. So CJ was trying to figure that out. And, we were, of course, we were a large customer. By that time, Stat Medevac had grown quite a bit. And so Larry came to me and said, hey, we have to figure this thing out. Can you help us figure out how we do this? Because they had been purely a traditional air operator relationship, monthly fixed fee for pilots and mechanics in aircraft and an hourly rate. Never had, there were no clinical people who were employed there.
Right.
So I said, sure. So, spent some time with them, sort of a free consulting project to help them figure out how to get into the business. And Larry went and presented that to the board at CJ, and I called him up a couple of weeks later and said, hey, how did it go? He said, oh, it went fantastic. When can you start? I said, wait a minute, I have a job. Thank you very much. I was just running the emergency physician practice in those days.
Yeah.
And, this was in 97, And he said, no, we need somebody to run this outfit. You may remember David Frank, who he ran Stat Medevac from the beginning, he and Karen Klein. David had been recruited over to CJ and was running their traditional contracting and all that sort of thing. And he had more than a full-time job, in those days. And anyway, I had an opportunity, so I decided to take that. In a roundabout way, there were some interesting twists there as well. But so I started in January of '98 at CJ.
Yeah, I didn't, I always learn new things. I didn't realize. So Stat Medevac was really the first helicopter program for CJ. Because they went on to a number of contracts. I mean, they had the Duke contract when I was there.
Yes. Yeah. And they made a couple of acquisitions. In 1989, they bought a company called US Jets out of bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And US Jets had a number of flagship clients, MedStar in Washington, D.C., PennStar in Philadelphia, and Shands Jacksonville, which is now part of the it was actually University Medical Center in Jacksonville in those days. The Trauma One program was a part of the US Jets book of business, and which is now Shands Health System or Shands Jacksonville. So yeah, I bought US Jet in '89, added a bunch of helicopters, added a bunch of pilots, contracts, and then Indianapolis Heliport, which was based in the Midwest, in the mid '90s. They bought Indianapolis Heliport, and it had programs like Miami Valley Hospital in Dayton, St. Vincent's Hospital in Toledo, Ohio.
Oh, right, right.
The program, the program there at Samaritan in Fort Wayne, and they were all Dauphine operators. So they went from having a bunch of Eurocopter products, old BKs, and some BO-105s actually still in the fleet, to having, I think, 6 or 7 365s of various. We had N models, N1s, and N2s back in those days. And in fact, I can remember we had so many Dauphines that when they came out with the new, and I'm drawing a blank on which one it was, the new Eurocopter aircraft it was like the Dauphine on steroids. Wayne Huizinga, who was the owner of the Miami Dolphins, had one of them, and they were having trouble with the struts on the landing gear. And Eurocopter sent the aircraft to us to work on, because we operated more Dauphines than anybody other than the Coast Guard, at least on the civilian side. So yeah, and it had the Miami Dolphins logo on it and all that stuff. In those days, we did. I'll tell you a funny story too. That thing went back to Miami with 3 or 4 terrible towels stuffed in the seats. And that did not go over too well with our friends from Eurocopter.
That's funny. Yeah. We used, I was at West Michigan Air Care. We had our own Part 135 that had the Dolphines, and used CJ for some of the more extensive maintenance and stuff. So
yeah, how times have changed.
Yeah. In fact, did I see an article? It was like the last one was just produced or purchased as far as the Dolphins. I think they've stopped that. I think again, reading your thing, you went back and got a master's degree in public management. When was that? Was that during this same time period? And why did you do that?
Yeah, I was still at UPMC in those days, and I was 19. I finished up the program in 1992. I liked administration, I liked operations, and I wanted to continue to do it for a while. And so, in our world, academic medical center, you had to really have an advanced degree to go to that next level. And it's interesting. There were, the University of Pittsburgh itself had a graduate school of public health, tremendous.
Yes.
And they had an MHA program. And the challenge was you had to do a 9-month residency. So you had to quit your job.
9 months.
A lot of the people that I worked for, my immediate boss, Shelley Gavar, and Tony Sanzo, who was the chief operating officer in those days, actually went on to run the West Penn Allegheny Health System as well here in Pittsburgh. Those guys had all been graduates of the program. They had to quit work and do a 9-month residency. It was a paid residency, but and at that time, we had our first child. Joyce was working as a nurse. She was in school getting a master's in nursing, and so I had an opportunity to do it. And the program at CMU, which is where I went, you had to be in management for 5 years. It was designed for people who were practicing leaders already. It wasn't
got you.
right out of undergrad school, and there was no residency requirement.
So it was a part-time. I mean, you could still be working and do the program.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
excellent. Yeah.
Night classes. So I did a couple nights a week, and we did homework, holding babies and all that sort of thing. I wouldn't advise that. I tell my kids, don't try that. Get your schooling done before you have kids if you can.
Yeah. Well, no, that's great though. How do you think that degree helped you in your career?
It was amazing because as a young person, and I was in my early 20s when I went to work in the hospital. They handed me this piece of paper called a budget variance report. I didn't know what it was. I had no idea. I said, variance report, what's this? And I had to work with it every month and produce a roll-up report as to the reasons for all, the explanations for all the variances in my cost centers and things. So it's getting that formal sort of thought process. But also, I found it, and we talked about this. We're going to talk about MTLI a little bit as well. But I find this is one of the beautiful things about MTLI is I was in the classroom with people who were running operations all over Western PA at different health systems and hospitals, and so I learned as much on the breaks and listening to the questions that people ask. I mean, I was a very green administrator in those days, and I learned a ton from the people around me that were in the program as well, and the faculty. The other thing they did was all the faculty, they were all practicing healthcare leaders. So the person who taught financial management 101 and 102 was Craig Trout. He was the CFO at a big community hospital outside of Pittsburgh, in Beaver County, actually, almost in your neck of the woods where you were raised.
Right.
He was the CFO of Beaver Medical Center. Tremendously experienced guy. So I learned a ton from people who were doing it every day.
So now I know where you get your financial experience now too. So I'm learning a lot here, Ed. This is great. So you were there at Corporate Jets when Air Methods made the purchase, and there was a transition. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we, the company was owned. Corporate Jets had private ownership, and Fred Shawless and Mr. Shawless made most of his money in the coal industry, and so he never really took any money out of CJ. We were able to plow all those resources back into new aircraft and training and equipment and things. But he got to a point where he was starting to wind down his business career and his business holdings. So he was looking for to find a place for CJ to be able to continue, but without him, as the primary owner. And we had grown quite a bit in those years. I think we doubled or tripled in size during the 11 years that I was there. It was crazy kind of growth. And the industry was like that as well. I think,
yes,
lots of new programs and lots of people, pushing the limits of the business, meaning doing creative things. I mean, again, remote basing was not something that was done in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, but boy, in the 90s, it really became something. So, yeah, so we had an opportunity to, Mr. Shawless had an opportunity to sell CJ. And so the company was sold. A couple of us, as a condition of the sale, had to stay on for 12 months to help with the transition, introduce the Air Methods folks to the customers and those sorts of things. So I did that. So I worked at Air Methods for a year as a regional VP. I had the Northeastern United States during that time.
Was there an opportunity to stay on with Air Methods, or did you want to move on?
No, there was. The folks in Air Methods in those days were great to me, and actually some of my colleagues. I had a colleague, Rob Hamilton, who actually had been the hospital-based Northeast vice president, and he grew up in Virginia.
Right.
Was involved in the programs there, and Rob was good enough to move his family. Actually, they moved out to Denver, and he took over the Midwest region, so that I could stay in Pittsburgh and be around my family and continue to work as a part of Air Methods. So I was very blessed in that regard. Oh, Rob, I tell him that all the time, that he did that. But I had never worked in a publicly traded environment before. It was a little bit unique for me. I had worked not-for-profit ambulance services and healthcare hospitals, and even CJ, while it was privately held and it was for profit, it operated more like a not-for-profit entity than than not. And so I had, it was a big adjustment for me. And I had a good friend who I'd known for a long time. We actually coached a little grade school basketball together, a fellow named Mike Lewis, who had founded QuickMed Claims, and they did the billing for our, I didn't mention this, but when we started CJ, my philosophy, my recommendation to Larry was to not do community-based operations, but to do hybrids or alternative delivery models where we partnered with the hospitals in the area, health systems, and in some cases, fire departments, to provide helicopter services. So we needed someone to do that, to handle the revenue cycle management work for us. And so we had hired QuickMed to do that. And so I was very familiar with the operation at QuickMed. And Mike Lewis came to me one day and said, hey, we're trying to grow the company. Why don't you come to work here? He said, and this is, I give him grief for this all the time. He said, there are no billing emergencies, he said to me, because as you know, during those years, in air medicine in general, we had our fair share of accidents, and I had a couple when I was at CJ.
Right.
I had one that year that I was at Air Methods, and those were a little taxing. I can remember, we had an accident on Mother's Day weekend, and it happens to be my wife's birthday too. And I remember throwing, some clothes in the bag and heading to the airport to hop on a plane to go to the site. And, I was gone for a week. Gone for a week. So Michael said to me, hey, there's no billing emergencies, you can come to work here. And of course there are billing emergencies because we're all trying to keep our heads above water from a financial standpoint. But so yeah, it's been great. And I've been at QuickMed now for 13 years.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. I think I remember talking to you at AMTC when you were right in that transition, and you were talking about QuickMed Claims. Had they done, were they mainly ground ambulance provider until STAT came on?
Started ground ambulance work, when the company got founded. Actually did some position billing in the early days. But when I went to CJ in 98, we had a hybrid program up in Cleveland. It was a partnership with the University Hospitals of Cleveland. And that was the first, we were the first air medical client of QuickMed Claims.
Oh, I see.
And then they went on to do the staff care program in Louisville. John Blumenstock hired Mike Lewis to do their work. I'm trying to think, there was a couple other places that were customers as well.
So STAT hadn't used them.
No, STAT was in-house.
It was okay.
Done at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center originally, and then eventually STAT Medevac formed its own billing office and had that for a number of years, and now it's been rolled back into what they call the central billing office there. But it was an interesting story because back in those days, when the hospital was doing the billing, there wasn't any pressure because the way STAT worked was it was a consortium. And at the end of the year, if there was a shortfall, the member hospitals would kick in an amount, and it was commensurate with the number of flights you got. So if you received 40% of the flights that year that STAT Medevac flew, then you were responsible for 40% of the shortfall. And it was the same with capital acquisitions. The hospitals had to fund new aircraft and all those things. We was a combination of those early days when I was on the STAT Medevac side of the ledger. We leased some aircraft through CJ and we bought some. So it was a little bit of both. And of course now, STAT owns, I think, all of its aircraft. Most programs, most larger programs, you realize the economics are such that it makes sense to own.
Yeah, that's good.
You went through that as well.
Right. Good economics in owning aircraft. At LifeLink, they were leased until I came up and we said, we need to purchase these. This makes so much sense in the long run. Let's go into, because you touched upon how reimbursements changed, and hospitals when they first got into this, a lot of times it was included under the Medicare stuff and sort of cost reporting, and people didn't pay that much attention to billing, and I was involved with that. I remember when I went to Duke, I mean, they were like way undercharging, what I thought. And in those days, you did your fixed cost was your rollout fee, and your variable cost was your fuel, gas, other things. But you were involved. We're going to talk. You've been very active in Ames and ACT, but let's first talk about the negotiated rulemaking, because that was a big thing that happened in our industry, and you were a major part of that.
Yeah, it was interesting. So the Balanced Budget Act of 1997 called for the formation of an ambulance fee schedule, a national fee schedule.
Right.
And as you recall, those early years, it was very frustrating, ground and air ambulances, because, and a lot of people don't realize this, that, Medicare doesn't pay us directly. There are third parties who contract with Medicare to adjudicate the claims and make the payments and things. They're called intermediaries or carriers.
Right.
And so what we found around the industry is, and wasn't unique to transport either, I think the physicians found this as well, is the way Medicare claims were paid was very different from carrier to carrier, region to region in the country. And so there was a lot of griping about that. And of course, the spend on ambulance of all types, not just air, in the in the 90s ballooned. People have this expectation about access to care and things of that nature. So the legislation, the BBA had a provision to create this national fee schedule. So there was this thing called a negotiated rulemaking that none of us were really familiar with. And the idea was that the federal government would get the key constituency groups in a room and have them hammer out a policy. In this case, it was the fee schedule itself. And so they assembled, the American Hospital Association, International Association of Firefighters, International Association of Fire Chiefs, American Ambulance Association, Ames. This was before ACT existed in those days.
Yes.
The National Association of County Governments, believe it or not. There was a fellow by the name of Ron Aycock from North Carolina who was the representative from the county government folks. And we got together once a month it took darn near a year and a half for 3 days. And our job was to hammer out this fee schedule. And I had chaired the Ames Finance and Reimbursement Committee. And so Denise Landis, who was the president at the time, asked me to represent the association. And we had a great team of people. Kathy McDonald, who ran Rare, and there were folks from all different kinds of programs. Lifeline Network up in the Pacific Northwest was represented. Their CEO was on the committee, and then we had some consultants, and we had Howard Solons, who was from Oberkaler, a DC law firm, was helping to advise us. So we went through the process with all the other constituency groups to try and figure out how to hammer out this fee schedule. There were some tight parameters. The spending, there was a base year spending, it might have been 95 or 96. So whatever we hammered out could be no more than what Medicare had spent on all ambulance work in that base year. So the fee schedule had to fit into that it was a finite bucket. And the real question was, how do we divide up the bucket? And we were, again, in the aeromedical industry, we were blessed because most of our providers, 90% probably in those days, were hospital based. And you made reference to the hospital cost report earlier.
Yeah.
So in the old days, Medicare reimbursement for hospitals was based on, you got an interim payment. So you took care of Aunt Minnie, gave her, she got her cardiac cath, and then you got an interim payment from Medicare at the time. And then at the end of the year, it was usually 6 or 8 months or more afterwards, the hospital would submit all of its cost data, and Medicare would do this computation. They would say, okay, well, the cost per case, the cost of a cardiac cath is X. So let's say it was $5,000. We paid you $2,500. So for all those caths you did last year, we're going to give you an extra $2,500. So there was this settle up that happened. And the beautiful part of that was aeromedical transport was included. So we went into the Medicare archives and we had years and years of cost data that Medicare had already audited through their process. So we hired Ernst & Young, which was a big six accounting firm at the time. And we said, we want you to go through the data and tell us what the number is. Tell us based on all these years of Medicare cost report data, because we wanted a third-party stamp of approval. And so they produced a report. And so we could walk into those meetings and say, here's the cost of air medical transport. And it's not our data. We didn't make this up. This is Medicare's data. We just got the files and made sense of them for you. And of course, the ground ambulance side didn't have that, right? Because there were very few hospital-based ground ambulances. Not only that, but they were even more disadvantaged because a lot of the big municipal ambulance services, they didn't care how much they got reimbursed because most of their budget was, the revenue was derived from tax revenues.
Right.
So they looked at the third-party reimbursement as a bonus. Many of them, their charges were way less than their cost because they didn't really care. So all of their charge data that came through was what Medicare had. And so they were looking at charge data and trying to, decipher what part of that was cost. So we were very blessed that we had that information and we're able to put it together. And we had a really good team, Denise and others that we worked, there were a lot of hours.
And I think what was the big issue is, you had that cost data, but, a lot of times the program directors and stuff, what was being charged by the hospitals was way less than that. And getting them, because there was a time period it was phased in, if I remember right, and
over 3 years.
That we had to get our charges up to cover the costs, and that's pretty hard in some hospitals because it's the cost reporting in the hospital to know, and
Right.
To know that, and most program directors at that time, and I think probably even some today at hospital-based programs, revenue's not even on their, radar. It's not
Right.
something
Yeah.
they manage expenses.
Right. I talked to a client just the other day, about 2 weeks ago, who I asked some questions about the No Surprises Act and preparation, and the response I got was, the finance people handle all that. They'll work with you on it. I'm just responsible for my expense budget.
Yeah.
And as long as I'm managing that to the expectation, I'm golden. And so you're right. There's a lot of people who are involved in leadership in the operations who the revenue piece is something that they don't work with day in, day out.
Well, before we get into the balanced billing and the No Surprises Act, what else? You've been an active member of AIMS and ACT. Tell us about some of the positions that you've had besides the negotiated rulemaking.
Yeah, I think, mostly just for me, it's been being an active part of the association, serving on committees, and I would encourage people in the industry, if you're out there listening to the podcast, if you're not engaged, please take the time to do it. It's great, first of all, there's wonderful people in this industry, and that if you're involved at all, and you and I talk about that frequently, that there are some great people. We have some of our best friends, or people that we've gotten acquainted with through the profession here. But we need folks who are younger, who have fresh ideas, to be actively involved in the associations, whether it's your professional association, if you're a communicator or a physician or a critical care nurse or critical care paramedic. We need people to be involved. And so for me, we of course QuickMed claims are members of both ACT and AIMS, and we are actively involved in both. And I've spoken at conferences, for both, and attend the meetings and things. I think, we need more people to be involved and actively to make sure that we're guiding the industry and providing the right resources. And of course, MTLI is part of that as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I know we were both involved with MTLI from the beginning, and then you were involved for much longer and through a transition. And we've talked, so that listeners, we're looking at doing an actual podcast on MTLI, some of the history and, where it's been and where it's going. So we won't go into all that, but you taught and were a regent for several years, and during some turbulent times too, had to take the reins of leadership. But one thing that I was very impressed with what you did was the MTLI Marasco Family MTLI Scholarship, right? And tell us about that. I think that was after I left, so I don't know a lot of the details on that.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Look, as I mentioned earlier, we've been very fortunate in life, Joyce and I, and we have great family. And so we made the decision a couple of years ago to create a family charitable trust. There are some things that are important to us as humans, and our children and their wives, the boys and their wives are very passionate about a number of things. And so we put some money aside for this family trust to give away every year. And so for me, following the lead of some other tremendous folks in the industry that, have donated lots and lots of resources to the industry over the years, we had an opportunity to do that. So we put together a scholarship from the Family Trust for MTLI. And so each year there'll be a first year and a second year student that will be sort of on scholarship, if you will. So the Medevac Foundation is the sort of the source of the money, or is the source of the process. So they have a committee and they take applications every year. And there's a number of scholarships for both undergraduate school as well as the Dr. Suzanne Weddle Scholarship for graduate school.
Yeah.
So, folks who maybe otherwise the program can't support them, maybe, on their own, it's the financial part of it is a tall ask. We want to make sure that there's access to the important training that's done at MTLI for anybody who wants to go. So, we were able to do that, make a commitment to do it for a number of years, 10 years, to make sure that there's some money there for folks who can't maybe otherwise pay, get there to go. So we're thrilled to do that. And the industry has been great to us. And as I mentioned, we talk about it all the time. Our best friends, are people that we've come across through the industry. So
yeah, that's a wonderful legacy, and congratulate you on that. It's really nice of your family to do that to help MTLI. I mean, we'll go into more detail, but I remember when we started, I thought, well, this thing will be over in a few years because we'll have gotten all the program directors, and it's been very, very successful program.
Yeah, and you probably remember, don't you remember the feeling? It was very daunting at the beginning because we were, I were teaching, we were part of the original faculty, and some of the people who were taking the program those first couple of years dwarfed us in terms of years of experience.
Yes,
in the industry. It was a bit daunting.
Right. Yeah. You learned a lot just by teaching. It was just great to stay up on it. Well, let's get into the No Surprises Act, which was implemented in January 1st. Give us a brief history of this legislation, why it came into being, and just some background on it.
Sure. Yeah. The issue is not a new issue. The concept of balanced billing is when a provider, so a physician, ambulance provider, a hospital, is out of network with an insurance company, which means they don't have a contract with the insurance company that specifies a rate. The insurance company in that circumstance will typically pay that clinical person a fee, what they call a usual and customary charge. It's usually some computation that the insurance company, the health plan, does. And then the provider, so the physician or ambulance service or air ambulance, has the opportunity then to bill the patient the difference between what the health plan paid them and what their full charges are. And when I talk to people about billing and reimbursement, I can remember teaching, talking about this in MTLI. I said, look, when you hire a plumber, they give you a price. And after the work is done, try telling the plumber, I don't think my allowable for that is not the $2,000 that you charge, but it's $1,500. See how that goes for you. Yeah. But in healthcare, that happens all the time, right? We provide the service, and someone else, and it's not even really the customer at the end of the day, or and whether you think of the patient or the health plan as the customer, that's up for debate as well. But a health plan will make that sort of seemingly sometimes arbitrary decision. And so the idea of doing that has been happening for a long time. And there's a term of art called cost shifting. One of the things that spawned a lot of that balanced billing is because most providers of healthcare don't get paid enough from the big payers. And that's, if you look at the payer mix of most organizations or physician practices or whatever, 50 to 60% is government payer, right? It's Medicare,
Yep.
covers older folks, or Medicaid, which covers folks, who maybe can't afford healthcare otherwise. And those two entities don't pay us our costs. We know that, and we could talk more about the ambulance fee schedule, because that, while we started at the base year with cost, there was an annual escalator that was the CPI minus 1%. And so we've lost 1% against the cost of living. And I would even argue over the course of the ambulance fee schedule, all these years that it's been in place, the cost of healthcare has gone up way, way above the consumer price index. All the commitments, particularly in air medical safety and clinical equipment,
right.
So it hasn't kept up. So what do we have to do in order to make ends meet? We have to bill commercial payers and private payers, which tends to be individuals, more than our cost, well more than our cost, to be able to make up what we lose on Medicare and Medicaid, and even the free care that we provide, right? Which most of these organizations will do lots of transports every year that we just don't get paid for. The patient doesn't have the money. And it's the right thing to do. We should provide that service, but we have to figure out how to make ends meet. So that cost shifting, and it's not typical, it's not unique to air medicine, it's physicians, hospitals, and whatever, it happens. And at some point, the commercial payers started to push back. And that's when this usual and customary, this lower payment began to happen. And of course, that's evolved over time. And the real genesis of the act is not really air medical transport. And one of the big scenarios that caused the heartburn, that caused great public outcry, which got Congress involved, is, and I just had this happen to me, Edward, just the other day. I had some medical work done, and my physician was in network, and I was trying to schedule a procedure. And I had two choices: early in the morning at a surgery center, freestanding surgery center, or late in the afternoon on Friday at the hospital surgery center. And I'm a smart guy, right? I know healthcare. I don't want to be last case of the day ever, because things get out of whack. I want to go first case in the morning. So I picked the first case in the morning, only to find out after the procedure was done that the facility was out of network. My physician was in. And that's what happens. If you go to, a lot of times you'll go to the local hospital emergency department because it's in network with your insurance, but you don't realize that the physician professional group, which is separate from the hospital, or the radiology group, which is separate from the hospital, or the pathology group or the anesthesia group, is not in network with your insurance. And so you get this surprise balance bill. So that's sort of what started things. And it took a couple of years. There was some fits and starts. There was a lot of really violent opinions on both sides about whether or not there was, balance billing was necessary. But I think everybody agreed on one thing, and as we have to find a way to get the patients out of the middle, because people were losing their homes and
absolutely
financial ruin on these things, and not because they were being improper stewards of healthcare resources or trying to get things. It was just they didn't know, and had they known, they might have made a different decision, particularly in some of those elective kinds of things. So anyway, there was a couple of years of back and forth, and finally, at the very end of the Trump administration in December, the No Surprises Act finally came together and got enough consensus to be passed. So that was, that was the fall of 2000. And the interesting thing about the No Surprises Act is, it had to be implemented by January 1 of 22. And you've been around a long time, and we've done some of the policy work together during your time around the industry as well. I mean, you could never get effective regulations and a sweeping policy change like this done in 12 or 13 months. It is impossible to do.
Yeah.
So that's where we were. The key provisions of the No Surprises Act are: no patients get unexpected balance bills. So we're no longer allowed to balance bill patients. For hospitals and physicians, it's in an emergency setting. For air medical transport, it's almost all we do, right, is emergency setting stuff. So other than maybe some elective fixed wing work that we do. So we're not allowed to balance bill patients anymore. But when you take away that ability for the providers and suppliers of services to recover that extra money, because again, that gap still exists, you had to put another tool in place to be able to resolve disputes between the health plans and the providers. And so that is what the term of art for that now is an independent dispute resolution process, or IDR. And so what happens now as a result of the act is we send a bill. The health plan is going to pay that number that they think is a fair number. The air medical provider can accept that number if they think it's good. If they don't think it's good, they can begin what's called an open negotiation process. We've been doing negotiations around these rates for years. It's nothing new. From the time
Be in network. Yeah.
Yeah. You get a rate, you get a payment. When you're out of network with a provider, you get a payment. If you don't like it, you're negotiating back and forth to come up with a rate. And then of course, if you didn't get a good enough rate, then you would bill a patient to balance. Well, now we can't do that. So that open negotiation process is still in place. It's we've got 30 business days to do it, but it's very formal. We actually have to notify the insurance, the health plan, of our intent to formally negotiate. We have that 30-day window. At the end of that window, if we haven't come up with a rate that's acceptable to us and to the health plan, then it goes to an independent third party, this independent dispute resolution process. And so there are entities that have applied to the federal government to serve as arbitrators. And they're being stood up now to be able to handle the process. And then we will present our case and what we think our number is that's a fair payment. The health plan will present their case and what they believe to be a fair payment to the arbiter. And they will review the information and at some point make a decision of which is the fair number. It's interesting for those of you who are sports fans, if you follow baseball at all, and I don't know exactly where this became sort of the piece of the legislation, but the arbitration is patterned after baseball arbitration. So the arbiters have no ability, except in one or two very limited circumstances, to provide a third option. We, the provider of air medical transport, are going to send a number in, and the health plan is going to send a number, and the arbiter has to pick one or the other. And that's how baseball arbitration works. You can't come up with a compromise. The player puts a number in, the organization puts a number in, and then the arbiter.
Why is that? Why you think? I always thought that's what arbitration was. Is that you?
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I don't know really.
I didn't know that.
How the legislation was formed. I don't know who pushed for that particular style of arbitration, but that's what we ended up with. So it makes it a bit of an art, because if you put a number in that's too high, you might cause the arbiter, who otherwise would think, your number that you got paid was not adequate. But if you put a number in that's too high, you're going to force the arbiter to side with the health plan. So, just a quick example, right? So a $40,000 air medical bill, maybe the usual and customary charge that the health plan pays is $20,000. You look at it and you say, well, geez, I can't take anything less than $30,000 for this trip. So you're going to put 30 in. And of course, the health plan is probably going to pick their number, which they paid you initially, which is 20. And then the arbiter has to pick one of those numbers. So how do they do that? Well, this is where the rub comes in. The law also had, and this is, again, not unique to air medicine. It's not unique even to this legislation. There's a term of art, a number called a qualifying payment amount, which is supposed to be sort of the prevailing charge or payment for a particular type of service. So the legislation called for the use of, the development of, computation of, and the use of the qualified payment amount as a tool to help handle these disputes. Unfortunately, again, this is part of this condensed regulatory process. When the legislation was authored, and then in the translation by the agencies that are implementing it, the qualified payment amount got pinned directly to the median in-network rate. So what does that mean, median in-network rate? So health plans have contracts with some providers, physicians, hospitals, air medical transport programs. So the computation of the QPA for, let's say, Blue Cross in Pennsylvania, Blue Cross is going to take that number of what they pay for all of their contracts. They may have 5 in-network air medical transport providers, and they may have 5 that service their population in Pennsylvania that are not in-network. So for the in-network providers, they take those 5 payments. So and it's based on, base rate and loaded mile rate, which is how we bill for air medical transport. and they say, the lowest rate is, $20,000 base rate. The next is 21. The next is 22. The next is 23, so on and so forth. And so they have to pick the middle one, and then they do the same for the mileage payment rate. And that's the median in-network rate, the middle in-network rate that they pay for the contracts that they have. And that becomes the qualifying payment amount. So why is that number important? Well, that's probably a benchmark that the health plans are going to use to pay us, because on the other side, if we can't come to agreement, the arbiters originally in the legislation were given 5 or 6 factors, including this qualified payment amount, to consider in arbitration. When the agencies, and by the way, there are 3 agencies that have responsibility for creating and enforcing the regulations: Health and Human Services, Treasury, and gosh, the third one just went on in my head, Labor. So those 3 agencies, the tri-agencies, have responsibility for administering the NSA. So when the 3 agencies got together, they sort of went off a little bit on their own, and they actually provided direction for the arbiters, the IDREs or IDR entities, to use the qualified payment amount as the primary determinant. In fact, it's the initial determinant for arbitration. In order to deviate from that number, the QPA, others have to prove, which means us primarily, right, the provider side, we have to prove that there's some reason why that's not a fair rate. So the other items mentioned in the legislation, which were minimized in the regulation, are things like special equipment on the aircraft, quality of the crew personnel, quality of the care provider,
type of aircraft,
right, unique things that the patient needs. And you think about it, you know from running programs, 2 adult cardiac patients that get flown in a facility are not all the same. So you can have one where that patient's rock solid, stable. They have some drips going from the outlying hospital. The crews are doing vital signs. They may not even adjust the medication dose during the transport. Everything is basically okay. They just need to get from point A to point B. We need to minimize their out of hospital time. And then you have another adult cardiac patient that maybe is on a balloon pump, that you use several very expensive medications to maintain their cardiac status during the transport. You may take a specialty team, think about neonates and pediatric cases. And so those 2 trips, they look the same on paper. They may have the exact same pickup point, drop-off point, the exact same load of miles. You may even use the same aircraft. You probably do to do that trip. But the cost and the level of intensity is very different. So the burden of proof is going to be on us, the providers, to say, hey, that median in-network rate is not enough for this transport. It may not even be enough for that rock stable patient, depending on the computation. So those are the rub points that sort of have come up since the regulations were formed.
Why was it, you think just because it was implemented so quickly that they only used that and deviated from the legislation? And that's what the lawsuits are all about right now,
exactly,
too, is that you can't just use that one factor because it's very it's a disadvantage for the provider,
right,
by just using that.
Exactly. And I think time was probably part of it. You think about, going back to the negotiated rulemaking process, just to develop the fee schedule, we met once a month for 18 months, 3 days at a time. And there was a lot of back and forth and discussion and challenges. There was a whole discussion around, we provide ALS level transport. We have paramedics on every trip. We have ALS equipment. We should get paid all ALS. Of course, CMS said, we're not opening up that can of worms. We can't pay you. That everyone would go out and hire paramedics and expect higher reimbursement, even when a patient was a BLS patient. So that's how ALS 1 and ALS 2 got derived. None of that dialogue took place in the NSA. There was no opportunity for there to be two-way give and take among the constituent parties around this issue. So from being around, there are several ways that regulations get published. An NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, is the more common way, and literally it's an invitation to the community, to all the constituent groups, to comment on what's been proposed by the agencies, and then even be a part of the process that help try and not correct the language, but adapt the language so that it's serves the purpose it's supposed to serve, and that it's reasonable and all those sorts of things. The other mechanism that agencies use to develop rules is called an interim final rule, or IFR, not to be confused with instrument flight rules in our world, which is very confusing for a lot of us. But that interim final rule is basically, it's the agency saying to the constituency groups, this is it. You know, feel free to comment if you want, but this is the language we're going with. We don't have time to take a year and a half to do that. So most of the No Surprises Act regulations were promulgated through an IFR, an interim final rule, which means there was really little opportunity for input. Now, all the major constituents have weighed in, obviously, you know, even uninvited. So, you know, ACT has sent letters to the agencies. AIMS has sent letters. Of course, the American Hospital Association, American Medical Association, all the big industry groups have weighed in through communication. There have been a series of meetings. The tri-agencies actually did have some, they had some actually public sort of communication.
And this was all before January 1st.
Yes. Yeah. Most of this happened last year, although, you know, those IFRs that came out, you know, there were none that came out before summer. Again, you know, less than, 6 months before the thing went live. So there was not a lot of opportunity to have dialogue and make adjustments. And so there were lots of issues raised by the professional associations and even, trade associations on the other side, people representing consumers and patients and, AARP. I mean, there's been lots of feedback throughout the formation of the legislation, but there wasn't really an opportunity with the regulations. So the real rub points for most people on the healthcare side are the fact that these QPAs are developed in a black box or computed in a black box by the health plans. We don't have all that data. In fact, if you did this because when you were running programs, your contract terms when you signed a contract with Blue Cross of Michigan, they were confidential. You weren't permitted to share those with any other program. So that information is not widely out there. The only entity that has the contract rates for everybody that's got an in-network contract in a certain given jurisdiction for air medical or emergency care or whatever else are the health plans. So they're in the position of having all the data points. They're in the position of computing this QPA and paying us accordingly. And we have really no visibility into that to challenge it. And the other thing it does, it gives them a tremendous advantage in the IDR process, because especially now that the QPA has been made the primary source, because now they know what the arbiter is going to see. We don't know that number. We don't know what the QPA is necessarily. We presume it's something around where they paid us, but it may not be. So we're having to make a decision on what number to submit, what offer to make.
Wow.
Legislation. Without having it. The health plans know it. They know the numbers. So there are some issues with that. The median in-network rate is already artificially low. For example, there are some things that were through negotiations in the legislation itself that were excluded. So single case rates. So, I'm born and raised in Western Pennsylvania. I have Highmark Blue Cross as my insurance. If I'm vacationing in Florida and I have a heart attack and I need to be flown, I'm going to be out of network. And the air medical provider in Florida, let's say it's AeroMed at Tampa General Hospital, they're going to negotiate a single case rate with Highmark and say, hey, we've transported Ed Marasco. You're charging me 40 grand. That's our usual and customary is 20 grand. And then there's negotiation back and forth. And we say, okay, we're going to negotiate an individual rate on this trip. We're going to pay you $27,000 on this trip, one time only for you, Highmark. That's it. Well, all those individual negotiations, those individual case rates were excluded. So it's only long-standing sort of large volume. So the number's artificially low, right? Because if you're AeroMed, if you're in an area that has lots of visitors, you have a lot of these single case rates that you use because you've got transient population. But the only number that can be used to compute the in-network rate is, the local patients that are with that particular health plan. So the number's already a little bit depressed over what our overall commercial payment experience is. It doesn't take into account when we have balance bill patients, we've gotten paid some of that money, oftentimes not. Oftentimes patients can't afford to pay much on the balance. But what we collect on a cash per transport basis from commercial payers in a not a network situation is not the median network rate. It's something higher. And so we already know we're have to live with something less. And it's far less than what it should be because we're just using that median in-network rate. And then we make it further a challenge because we make that the primary sort of focus in the arbitration.
Well, before we get into the lawsuits, I mean, the other thing is, I think, air medical charges are so all over the board because you've got some hospital, and I'm generalizing a little bit, some of the hospital providers that aren't that savvy, that are not billing that much. So then those get calculated into this average. And then you've got some of the, the criticism of some of the for-profits has been they were way out there. And then, I had the fortunate experience of being at a not-for-profit, independent consortium where, you had to bill. I mean, we had to make ends meet, and this was what it really cost us. And I remember doing, negotiations on that, but, that all plays into this too, because it's so all over the place.
Right. It does. And look, take the variable of for-profit, not-for-profit, private, public, take that all out of it. You hit the nail on the head. And that is, there are different structures of programs, and those programs, in some cases, they have to make ends meet, just like you and I do with our personal budgets, right? There's no subsidy there.
Yeah.
And they have to do it on the transport. Now, you could argue that even in the consortiums, if they have other sources of revenue. So, air medicine is a high fixed cost enterprise, right? So you got to pay for that overhead with a number of flights. But if you operate a large ground ambulance, you're getting some overhead contribution to that overhead that manages both air and ground, right? If you're a fire department and you operate a medical helicopter, but you also operate fire department, you might operate fire department EMS, that training overhead, the office staff all gets spread out over a larger bucket. So there's different business models or different operational models, if you will.
Yes.
And it doesn't have much to do, to be honest, some of the not-for-profit consortiums that have to live in their means and live on a budget, their charges are in many cases every bit as high as the big quote unquote for-profit publicly traded guys.
Yeah.
It's about your mechanism, right? And of course the argument on the hospital side is, and I've heard this for years when I was on the hospital side, and it's true and not true, and that is, well, you hospital people don't care because you get all the downstream revenue. You don't care if your program loses money. And in the early days, in the 70s and 80s, that may have been the case. But most hospitals now are forcing their programs, whether it's the Digestive Disorders Center or the flight program, to be financially responsible and financially viable. It's not like it was. There's still some of that, but it's not as prevalent as it was in the 80s and such. So depending on your philosophy of your institution, yes, my hospital might get that downstream revenue, but they don't give it to me. I don't get credit for it. I got to fight for that.
Right.
And so I may be arguing to negotiate every bit as hard with third-party payers as the program manager or the person responsible for that business unit in certain circumstances. On the other hand, I've seen the opposite as well, where we've talked to clients and we talk to their managed care people and say, hey, your flight program is being paid woefully under the industry standard. You should, next time your contract's up, you should negotiate a better rate. And their reply in some cases is, it's a zero-sum game for us. If I get more for the flight program, the payer is going to pay me less for the emergency.
Exactly. Yep. Or whatever. Yeah, I experienced that firsthand. At places that, I'd get them to thinking that this is where the charges need to be, and then like the very next year, say, well, we're going to have to lower that because, we want to go to the community and say our charges only increased 2%, but yet maybe certain areas went up 30%, and others don't. I mean, and, they're trying to stay afloat and play the game with where they can get reimbursed. I understand that. So what are the what's driving the lawsuits then? Is it because of the QPR? I mean, is that what the, I mean,
Yeah, the QPA.
QPA,
There's a couple of common themes. If you looked at all the lawsuits that are out there, and the Texas Medical Association was the first to file, as physicians in Texas, and then of course the Air Medical Association filed, and then the American Medical Association, American Hospital Association, and now there might be 16 or 17 suits. There are some individual physician practices that have filed. There are some multi-specialty groups that have filed. I think the Georgia Medical Association filed last week or the week before. The primary concerns are really twofold. One is it's the definition of the QPA and how it's computed, and the second thing is that the QPA was made the primary tool that the arbiters can use, and the argument is that's really an overreach on the part of the agencies. That was not intended by the members of Congress who signed, who approved the legislation. In fact, there was a letter written right before, I think it was right after the Texas Medical Association suit was filed. Don't hold me to the timing exactly, but there were several hundred Congress people who wrote and said that these regulations were an overreach. They misrepresented the intent that Congress had with the No Surprises Act in these two particular instances. So clearly the agencies have sort of gone off the reservation a little bit. And what caused the lawsuits ultimately was the fact that there wasn't enough time or interest on the part of the agencies to hear out the various constituency groups. And look, in their defense, again, they weren't given near enough time to put this thing in place. And we're still, even though it's in place, I mean, in December, and I haven't looked lately, but in December, there were only 9 or 10 IDR entities who had applied through the portal to do these arbitrations. That's not just for air medicine. That's for all of health.
For everybody. Yeah, geez.
There's no way that 10 entities are going to be able to take the caseload and get them decided quickly enough. And they don't have, again, there's specific timelines. We found there's this open negotiation form that you have to file with the health plan. You have to notify the health plan. And then also it goes through this online portal to Health and Human Services. So they're aware that you're in a negotiation now with the health plan. And the federal government put this form out. Nowhere on the form is any case identifier. This template form that everybody's supposed to use. So the only thing that could distinguish patients is date of service. So if you do 2 flights on the same date of service with the same health plan, one you want to have an open negotiation on, the other one you're happy with the payment, you send one in. There's no way for the health plan to know which of those 2 patients you flew on that day. So I called the helpline, the NSA helpline, and I was on the phone for a couple hours, and there was a conversation back and forth with supervisors and that sort of thing. And eventually they came back and said, well, here's an email address. This is our helpline email address. Describe your problem. And so I wrote that, the second week of January, and haven't heard a response yet. And we're trying to automate those forms because we're going to have to send them out on behalf of our clients, So we're trying to make it automated. We don't want to leave any problem. We're using Smartsheets, the Smartsheet application, to do that. And so we had to go ahead and just put an identifier on the form, case number or claim number on the form, and hopefully they won't get rejected. Now, we sent our first one out actually this week. So with any luck, they'll accept it. The health plan will accept it.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how many people have filed already? I mean,
yeah, well, we're right at the beginning of the process, right?
Yeah.
Normally, if you did a trip on January 1st, you might not see a payment because a lot of air medical.
Yeah, true. Yeah,
they're on paper review. They want to see all the notes.
Yeah.
Because of the dollar amounts and the complications, the level of complexity of the cases. So if you send all that stuff out, and then of course, most of the health plans, they have 30 days. In some states, they have a limit. Some states, they don't. So you get paid 30 days later. So for those trips we did in the beginning of January, first week in January, we're probably just getting payments the first week in February. You're looking at the number and figuring out the numbers within the range of acceptable to the client. Like in our case, we're representing our clients. And then you make a decision, you're going to put the notice out. So again, those first notices that we sent out just sort of went out this week.
Yeah.
And then they have 30 business days to complete that process of negotiation.
So we're still early stages. Doesn't this, Ed, give a huge advantage to the insurance companies? And they might not want the programs to be in network anymore.
That's a great point you raised. And so I didn't mention this early on, but the actual initial median in-network rate is computed on those agreements that were in place as of January 31st of 2019. So that's kind of the base year.
Oh, wow.
So you're exactly right. If that rate, that median in-network rate from January of 19 is lower than some of the existing, so let's say I had a new negotiation with the local health plans in my area during COVID, first part of COVID, maybe it was the summer of 20. And I made my case that, we have all this extra cost and we're doing, we can do fewer transports because we got to take the aircraft out of service and all those things you can understand from running operations yourself. There's some legitimate arguments there. So if I got a more favorable rate in 20 when I did my negotiation with the health plan, and now it's up again in the spring of 22, and we've already seen this happen, I can see where the payer's saying, that's okay, we don't want to renew with you.
Yeah.
Or we don't want to renew with you at that rate, because they know the number from back in January of 2019, and they know if that's the standard, that they're going to win these arbitrations by paying, instead of, maybe that rate was at 75 cents on a dollar, 75% of charges, and the rate you negotiated in 2020, which is going to expire in a couple of months, was 81 cents on a dollar. Well, they know that rate's better. Why would they pay us? Why would they stay in network with us? Why wouldn't they just take their chances? Let us be out of network and pay us the 75%, because that's going to be the standard.
Yeah. It's a mess. I mean, what's the lawsuit process? Where is that going to go? And are these going to get combined, or is there some big differences between the air medical and hospital and physician piece of this?
Oddly enough, there aren't a lot of big differences. I mean, the same two gripes. I mean, the hospitals have a few other fish to fry, if you will. So for non-emergency cases, there's this thing called, there's a bunch of notices that need to go out. They have to be in, I think it's 30 languages or something bizarre like that. If someone's out of network and they present to the hospital and they want to get an elective surgery done, like my situation I was describing last fall, I would now get a notice that says you're out of network for this service. So if you want to go ahead and have the procedure done here, that's fine, but we're letting you know. And then you have to provide a good faith estimate to the patient for what it's going to cost for that procedure. So that, I think some of the hospital side lawsuits are also include some of those concerns, because it's not, putting together those notices, even identifying truly out of network patients. And the hospitals also are responsible. They might be in network with that particular health plan for that patient, but if one of their hospital-based physician contractor groups is out of network, the hospital's responsible for making sure those notifications happen, even though the notice come from the physician group.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. It's been problematic. I've been on a bunch of those calls with our hospital clients, and where I serve as a board member, we've had lots of conversations about that, trying to comply. It's not easy. Software systems need to be modified, those sorts of things. So I think the hospitals have a few more gripes, but the common themes are the computation of the QPA and the fact that the QPA is used. So actually what recently happened, I think it was last week, is that the judge who was hearing both the AHA/AMA case, so the Hospital Association, the Physician Medical Association filed jointly.
I see.
And it was the same judge who Ames filed suit with in the same jurisdiction. And so the judge came last week and said, these are basically the same case. I'm joining the cases. And because Ames filed first, Ames is actually the lead plaintiff. So that case now is being, the Ames team, of course, working in concert with the American Medical Association and AHA folks, will try to adjudicate the case from a plaintiff perspective. So there's some deadlines and things that are, there's discovery, as you know, with all these kinds of things, information back.
But that could go on for months, right? I mean,
It could. I mean,
Yeah.
there was some of the initial filings in many lawsuits were sort of requesting summary judgment and immediate relief from the No Surprises Act. I don't think anyone was successful in getting that determination. This is still a challenge for patients, and we still need to get patients out of the middle. So I don't think there's any appetite, judicially or otherwise, to roll back that balanced billing prohibition.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
We got to have that. And if we have that, then we have to have these other tools in place. So the question is, how quickly can we resolve the issue on things that are going to impact arbitration and open negotiation, so that we can carry the process forward? But I would be shocked if somebody rules that the prohibition gets struck down. I just don't think there's.
Yeah. I think you're right on that. Has ACT did not file a suit, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So ACT did not join the AIM suit. In fact, last week or the week before, ACT filed an amicus brief, which is other interested parties,
right,
when a lawsuit like this is filed, can weigh in one way or another. And so ACT made a decision to file an amicus brief, not in support of one aspect of the Ames lawsuit. So one of the elements of the Ames lawsuit, and this I think also was a part of the American Hospital Association lawsuit, is for there to be multiple QPAs. So in the specific aspect of the Ames lawsuit, Ames had proposed that there would be a different QPA for those that are sort of hospital owned, because of some of the factors you and I talked about earlier in the conversation. And the ACT membership, the ACT board, did not feel that that was a reasonable way to go. There was some sense, I think, listening, and I was on the ACT membership call last week, that it would result in hospital-based programs, many of whom already have poor reimbursement because of some of the things we talked about, getting poorer reimbursement, because if they had their own QPA and they were lumped together and not with the rest of the world, that reimbursement would drive down even further and cause more heartache on the hospital side. And so ACT did not elected to disagree with the lawsuit in that regard. As reported by the ACT board on the call, they do agree with some aspects of the lawsuit, primarily the fact that the QPA is not a fair rate in the way it's currently
the only factor, right?
Yeah, and the fact that it's the only factor. I think the ACT membership, and I think the ACT board, as communicated on that call, believe that those two things are problematic in the way the current regulation stands.
Yeah, because ACT is always, when I was involved, I think before, always trying to differentiate, the types of services, the types of crews, the types of aircraft, the types of services. So. Yeah.
Yes, and I think you probably remember this from your time there. Is ACT has made a proposal already, and it's one of the positions that ACT has, which I personally support. It's an interesting thing. We don't have levels of service on the air medical side.
Right.
We have fixed wing and rotor. On the ground side, we have levels of service, and that makes an awful lot of sense. Again, it going back to the negotiated rulemaking process on the ambulance fee schedule. When we made the argument, not we, but when the firefighters and fire chiefs and American Ambulance Association made the argument that there are readiness costs associated with having an ALS truck. There's equipment, you have different crew, different personnel on board. You should get paid for that. Of course, it was HCFA back then, not CMS, which represented Medicare, which was the Medicare agency, said, we're not opening up that can of worms because everybody's just going to go out and hire paramedics and put equipment on the trucks, and they're going to expect every call to get paid, even if they did nothing. And so that's how the idea of ALS-1 and ALS-2 came to be. ALS-1 recognized that when you get a legitimate call, someone with chest pain, and you roll out with an advanced life support equipped vehicle, there are costs associated with that. If you get there and it turns out that chest pain was really someone who has a little bit of indigestion after having a big meal, and you transport them basically BLS skill-wise, you don't do any advanced procedures on them, you get paid ALS-1, which is higher than BLS, so you get some compensation for those readiness costs. Whereas when you go and that chest pain turns out to be a cardiac arrest and you empty the drug box, you get paid ALS 2, which is that higher level. So and we talked about that cardiac example we just used earlier in the conversation today.
Yeah.
Conceivably, that might be a air medical transport, stable level. And that patient who was unstable and used a bunch of medications on would be the next level up. And then that third level is that complex patient that's on an LVAD, and we send a specialty team and all those things that we do in the air medical world. And so I think that makes perfect sense. It fits the paradigm of reimbursement. It's how we bill in the emergency department.
Right.
Technical fees. There's levels of service based on complexity of patients and review of systems and things. So it's certainly something that makes sense in the reimbursement paradigm. For sure.
Yeah, and there also, even on the ground side, needs to be a critical care rate. I know there's a specialty care, but really, almost the same services that you're offering in the air, but by ground. And that's been a big disadvantage for some of the air medical programs to get into that, because it doesn't make the money. One other question, is it the reason that ground ambulance was not included in the No Surprises Act because of the fees? Was it just because the fees are so much less, or was there another reason?
I think that's the primary reason. Again, that's Ed's opinion. I don't have any particular policy insight on that, but I think, look, air medicine got on the radar screen with this larger issue of balance and surprise billing because of the orders of magnitude. If you get a balance ambulance bill for $150 for most patients, they're not going to lose their home over that. But when you get a balance bill for $20,000, that's problematic for a lot of working families. And so I think that's why air medicine got lumped in with larger No Surprises Act issue. Now, interestingly, there are some state laws that have already been passed. There are some state regulations that have been in place that affect the ground side. And let's not forget, one of the reasons that I think air medicine got lumped in with the NSA is because the Airline Deregulation Act made it next to impossible for states to regulate this matter relative to air medical transport. On the ground ambulance side, if there's a huge issue with balance billing in a particular jurisdiction, they have the wherewithal through state legislation to address the issue. But air medicine doesn't, because of the ADA, doesn't allow, and several states have tried to regulate it. So, and that's an interesting distinction too. It's a point worth mentioning, is that whole process we described that's enumerated in the NSA is superseded if there's an existing state process in place to accomplish the same thing, to adjudicate a disparity in the balance billing in an out-of-network billing situation. The process will be defaulted into whatever the state process is. That's what the legislation says. So again, what I described in terms of open negotiation and IDR and stuff, if there's a process in the state, we'll have to follow that state process. Which
makes it even more complicated.
Right. Yeah. In fact, just talking to Tom Allenstein the other day at MedFlight in Columbus, and they just recently passed and put into effect, I think the 15th or 14th of January, a balance billing act in Ohio. So, which does apply to ground. So the double whammy of having to live with the NSA on the MedFlight side, but they have a giant ground operation, their Medcare operation. Right. It's now subject to the provisions of the Ohio NSA.
Yeah. Well, one other question on all this: how has this affected the membership programs? I noticed that Classic was dropping their membership program. Is this going to be the end of membership programs for air medical?
I mean, I think that's almost by design. I think, and I had the opportunity to be a part of the Air Ambulance Patient Billing Advisory Committee process that the Department of Transportation went through. Unfortunately, there are a lot of good people who served on that committee, and some of the subcommittees spent a lot of time trying to address this issue of balance billing and surprise medical bills, and the DOT staff put in hours and hours. And they came up with some recommendations, but one of the issues that group studied. We had a number of conversations in a couple of different subcommittees, was membership programs. There is this sense, I'm not directly involved in any membership programs, and we never had one when I was on the operations side, but there's a sense that they are all over the board, and some of them are operated more reputably than others, let's say. And so I got the sense from the DOT and the HHS people who were part of that process that they wanted to see membership programs go away. Well, certainly with the NSA being passed and there being no risk for patients to get a balanced bill, that takes the wind out of a lot of the sales of these membership programs that have been sold over the years. Because if you don't have that exposure, why do you need to spend the money on the membership program? Spend that money on an HSA or some other mechanism to help you handle your high deductible health plan exposure and some of those out-of-pocket expenses. So an air medical or even a ground membership becomes less and less valuable to you if you're in a jurisdiction that has limitations on out-of-network balance point patients.
Right. Right. Well, great conversation. I wanted to ask you a little bit on the personal side. Tell us about your family, your wife, Joyce, your children, grandchildren. You've got a big family.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, living the dream, for me. Just turned 60 this year, and Joyce is a couple of months behind me, but we've been married a long time, and she's still doing it. She's a nurse practitioner and works some urgent care and some primary care, and so we're blessed. And we've got, as you probably remember, we've got 3 sons.
Right.
Matthew is in his early 30s, works for the FBI. Adam is late 20s and works for Ernst & Young, is doing well. And Eric just is graduating from medical school here. He's match day is March 18th. So we're convening in Pittsburgh. Everybody's getting together. We're going to celebrate wherever he ends up.
What's he want to go into?
He's interested in pediatrics. So he's,
nice.
And really pediatric genetics is something that's really a passion for him. So they're all 3 married. They have wonderful wives. I mean, we are, again, very blessed. All 3 of these women are fantastic, bright folks. And of course, Matthew and Sarah we have a grandson. Jack turns a year here next week. And then they have another one on the way. So
great.
We'll have 2.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I know you've always talked about your family over the years. Nice to follow. Boy, they grow up fast, though, don't they? I mean, it's just like all of a sudden,
they really do.
They're in their 30s. Yeah,
yeah, it's amazing. Well, better than anybody. You're chasing. You've got adult children out there. You're chasing around and trying to keep up with. And it's fun to watch them go through. Getting married, buying houses, having kids, career changes. They have opportunities now. And I tell you, the one thing about this generation that's eye-opening for me. My father worked in the post office for 38 years. I've had essentially 3 big career jobs. I mean, I've worked an average of 12 and a half years at each of my big, I was a stock boy in a grocery store when I was 15 or 16 or something, but my real professional life has been with 3 different organizations. Young people today, if they're in a job more than a year and a half, they feel like they're missing an opportunity or leaving money.
Yeah.
So it's funny to watch them go through those, it might be the right time. The headhunters are starting to call, but I'm looking for a certain kind of role. I want that balance of quality of life. And it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. My oldest son, I think he's ended up in the healthcare arena too, doing, implementing, electronic medical records for hospitals. They're a firm that hires the IT people that helps hospitals, but he's been with like 5 different firms. And I said, I can't relate to this. I worked on kind of the not-for-profit side my whole career. I don't understand all these things, but he is. Neither of them were married, but he's getting married now. So that's Alex, and that's nice to see. So what do you like to do for fun, Ed? What's your?
Well, I love to get out and ride the bike, and I know you do hardcore riding, long distance riding. But for me, I enjoy the rails to trails thing in Western Pennsylvania. when we come down south into South Carolina, there's a great opportunity. It's scenic. Up north, you're riding along the riverbanks in western Pennsylvania. It's beautiful, great way to spend a summer afternoon after work. Great stressor. So we love to ride the bikes. I love to fish, and I just really enjoy those opportunities to be with the grandson. So we're heading to Richmond this weekend to babysit our grandson while Matt and Sarah are off to a wedding or something this weekend. It's one of the best things in the world.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I wanted to give a call out to Quick Med Claims for supporting the National EMS Memorial Bike Ride and also the Pennsylvania one. I think that's great. And, because I've gotten to know a lot of people from East Coast. I participated more in the Midwest ride, but it's been fun. And then everybody's sort of on this Strava thing where you're following all these different routes all over the place. And I can upload their route into a Garmin and then actually ride it on my indoor trainer. So I can say I rode in Western PA. So,
fantastic.
Yeah. So
kudos to the riders, yourself and others. I mean, Doug Garrettson, I think, has made the ride a bunch of times. Someone who's been around the industry for a long time. I mean, those guys really, it's amazing. And having, been a part of the memorial service for a couple of years, it's a poignant moment when those bikes, arrive on Friday night and the families are there. And it's great. And kudos to the folks, Jana Williams and that group, Craig Yale and a bunch of others, Tom Liebman, Steve Worth from PWW, those folks, that board, the testers, Rachel and Ron, they devote endless hours of time to make sure that, those families are recognized as they should be.
Yeah, it's quite an experience because I like bicycling, and then it was actually Tammy Chapman that told me I should ride in that, and then the first time I did, I go, oh my gosh, this is just unbelievable. It's just it's a very touching experience. And last couple of years, I've done more virtual because of COVID stuff, but hopefully this year will be back on. So,
you have to try that Allegheny Trail thing. You got to do the Western Pennsylvania to Washington, D.C.
No, I know. I'd like to do that one. I've talked to those guys and said I'd like to be down there, back in my original area. So, well, Ed, I know I've taken up a lot of your time. I really appreciate you being on the podcast, and your expertise and time are very much appreciated. I'm sure the listeners will enjoy learning more about this.
Thanks, Edward. It's a privilege to be with you, and please keep up the great work. I know it's a lot of work on your side, but it's important to keep the folks around the industry current on what's happening and give them an opportunity to stay abreast of the important issues we face. Yeah,
and I'm a student of history too, and I think it's good for people to understand. That's why I'd like to go into backgrounds to understand where you came from and how you ended up there. And same with other podcasts. And I look forward to working with you on the MTLI one. So, Thanks so much, Ed.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Air Medical Today podcast. Please come back again and also subscribe to future shows by visiting the website at airmedtoday.com, iTunes, or on the Air Medical Today YouTube channel. Air Medical Today is also, as I've said, on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Instagram, and YouTube, and you can find the links on the website. Remember, if you would like to be a sponsor or provide feedback, please write to webmaster@airmedtoday.com or call 612-367-6052. A very special thanks to Stanley Reeves of Room Tunes for providing his song Track 5 for use as the theme song for the podcast. You can follow Stan on Facebook at facebook.com/stanley.reeves.39. Take care and continue to be safe, especially with this pandemic.